My name is Noon. I am one of the PhD students here in the Religious Studies Department. Whether first time here or you've come and participated before, we want to welcome everyone to our final event this year. The Ptarmigan series showcases a slate of distinguished scholars who discuss various themes related to late ancient studies, and this evening is no exception. For this event, we actually budgeted about an hour, but now about 50 minutes. That includes a mini lecture followed by question and answer. And if you have any questions throughout this lecture, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom. And without further ado, for today's program, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Jennifer Knust, Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University. Dr. Knust has received numerous awards, honors for contributions to the field, including for her research on early Christianity and discourse. And today, Dr. Knust will be speaking to us on a history of modern textual criticism. And so with that, I pass you the microphone.
Thank you very much. And again, I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties. I'm glad they were resolved. And I'm really grateful to you, of course, for not only for solving my technical problems, but also helping to invite me and to this wonderful lecture series. And also many thanks to Michael as well. I see he's here as well. So thank you very much. And since we're running late, I guess I won't spend a lot of time with thank you. I'll just get right to it. Let me share my screen. And if you're having any problems seeing that, please let me know. Let me start my PowerPoint. Hopefully you can see that. If I can get the PowerPoint to begin, that would be helpful. Sorry, just having trouble getting that working, of course. Actually, I normally don't have trouble with this thing. I don't know what is going on. I'm up in Maine with my family. The semester's over at Duke. Maybe I'm just too relaxed at this point to do what I need to do. Okay, here we go. Slideshow, play from start. All right, are we good? Can we see? Can you just, Anush, can you just like give me a thumbs up or say, yes, we're good, and I'll just get going. Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thanks. I just needed a little reassurance after all the excitement this evening. Whew. Okay, so first, this talk comes out of 3 separate projects that I've been working on, one of which has been published, one of which is about to be published, and one of which is still very much in progress. So I really invite everyone to weigh in and offer me advice and correction before it's too late for me to mess this up. So over the course of the novel Middlemarch, a gradual disenchantment with the ostensible erudition of her exacting husband, Mr. Casaubon, overtakes Dorothea, the initially misguided heroine. The poor man, with his taper stuck before him, George Eliot observes, forgot the absence of windows, and noticing only deficiencies in the scholarship of others, he became indifferent to sunlight. The Reverend Mr. Casaubon's conceit, that he might finally discover an unimpeachable key to all the mythologies, led him to spend his days compiling data, poring through books, ignoring his young wife, and exercising a talent, chiefly of the harrowing kind, to pursue a project that he would never contemplate. Modern New Testament textual criticism, with its endless quest for an original or initial text, its devotion to compiling ever more data, and its fantasy of unimpeachable scriptures, can appear to be engaged in a Casaubon-like quest. Far from producing an unimpeachable key to textual knowledge, New Testament textual criticism proliferates texts and elicits a seemingly endless stream of critical methods and their products. Indeed, since 1898, the editors responsible for the Nestle Aland editions of the Greek New Testament have published 28 revised editions and are currently preparing a 29th, each slightly different in its particulars. Other editions, and there are several others, add further complexity to what has now become a plethora of originals, or, using the current preferred nomenclature, initial or Ausgang texts, the text from which all others most likely descended. How did this happen? How did the bold 19th century innovations of figures like Karl Lachmann, F.J.A. Hort, and B.F. Westcott, contemporaries of George Eliot, end up producing such a remarkably unstable, endlessly impeachable critical text? Though a full answer to this question far exceeds what I can accomplish this evening, or ever for that matter, For the sake of this argument, I will highlight three aspects of this history as I understand it, and introduce three examples designed to illustrate my claims. Textual criticism, I argue, suffers from three historically situated symptoms of Euro-American intellectual, political, and cultural life. One, textual nostalgia as a way of formulating the sense that we are modern. Two, scientism as a solution to social problems. And three, governmentality as a strategy of shredding information through endless devices that are processed through still more devices. These symptoms, I further argue, can be detected in three episodes that I have been studying in other contexts. One, the discovery, introduction, and publication of the Medieval Greek Gospels Codex, British Library, Egerton 2610, also known as Gregory Allan number 700, and its earlier shelf mark, Evangelium 604. Alterations to critical texts of the Gospel of Mark, with particular attention to the recently published Editio Critica Maior of that Gospel. And three, Cold War expeditions to Jerusalem, Mount Sinai, and Mount Athos undertaken by the American team of the International Greek New Testament Project under the auspices of the Library of Congress. Other examples could also be offered, but these are the ones I've been working on recently, so we're going to focus on them. Thank you again for this opportunity to try to bring together some of my thinking on this topic and this history. I look forward to your thoughts, interventions, and suggestions so that together we can figure out how to let in a little bit more sunlight. Part 1, nostalgia. In 1890, the American industrialist and amateur textual critic Hermann Hoskier dedicated analysis of the newly discovered 11th century Gospels manuscript, Evangelium 604, that is Gregory Allan 700 or Egerton 2610, to the memory of John Berjean, the recently deceased Anglican dean of Chichester Cathedral, in recognition of his true friendship, fellowship, and helpful intercourse, and his unflagging efforts to prepare reliable foundations upon which might securely rest the true science of the textual criticism of the New Testament. Hoskier's dedication was followed with a compelling account of his visit to Berjean's study a decade earlier at midnight as the younger scholar and his mentor mounted the stairs. There, the dean offered a prophecy that, Hoskier laments, has yet to come true. As surely as it is dark now, as certain as the sun will rise tomorrow morning, so surely will the traditional text be vindicated and the views I have striven to express be accepted. I may not live to see it, most likely I shall not, but it will come. Hoskier intended the publication of his collation of Evangelium 604, Gregory Allan 700, to bring Berjean's prediction about the vindication of the traditional Protestant text of the Gospels, that is the 16th century Textus Receptus, closer to fruition. In 1882, Berjean had published a letter in The Guardian affirming the great value of this same codex to the discipline. Extolling the manuscript as a key source for the corroboration of the traditional text, Berjean offered another prediction. Studious men will obtain real help in the classification of Evangelia by paying diligent attention to many a circumstance like the foregoing, a reference to the paratextual details of this charming little copy. Then, indirectly conjuring another partisan defender of the Textus Receptus, George Salmon, Regius Professor of Divinity at Trinity College, London, Berjean professed to know a learned professor at Dublin who to some extent will be of my opinion. Berjean's predictions, however, were not to be realized, despite Hoskier's attempts to the contrary. Evangelium 604 failed to play an important role in textual criticism, and at this point it would be difficult to find a reputable New Testament textual critic interested in the value of this manuscript towards contribution to an understanding of an original, initial, or Ausgangstext. Still, Berjean and Hoskier's prediction about types and the possible contribution of 700 to identifying them did enjoy a larger life. Grouped as one of the witnesses to the controversial and so-called Caesarian text, 700 went on to play a starring role in debates about text types and their origins, with Cursa Blake and like-minded colleagues placing its text in this broader group and B.H. Streeter working to establish this text connection to Caesarea. Thus, 700 has been important in the history of the discipline, even if it has failed to rescue the traditional text. A product of its own time, Hoskier's collation nevertheless calls attention to an enduring feature of textual criticism, even now, its nostalgic commitment to an original that has been irrevocably lost. Nostalgia is a structuring condition of modern life, a form of homesickness, or in German, Heimweh, for some authentic past that, in Lynn Huffer's terms, both creates and obliterates a lost object. It is not that modernity has lost authenticity. Rather, the sense that authenticity has been lost is fundamental to the production of the idea, we are modern. The term Heimweh, from which the English term nostalgia was drawn, was invented in 1688 to describe the despair of Swiss mercenaries fighting in foreign wars. This sad mood, originating from the desire to return to one's native land, incurred symptoms that included persistent thinking of home, melancholia, insomnia, anorexia, weakness, anxiety, smothering sensations, and fever. Nostalgia entered English as a translation for Heimweh in 1756, when J.G. Keisler's Travelers Through Germany, Hungary, Bohemia, Switzerland, and Lorraine was published. The fine mountain air of Switzerland, Keisler reported, leads the Swiss to feel a kind of anxiety and uneasy longing after the fresh air to which they were accustomed from their infancy, without being able to account for such disquietude. Taken up in medical, psychoanalytical, and philosophical literature to describe a more generalized longing to escape the present by means of the past, by the 19th century, Heimweh nostalgia referred broadly to the retrospective reimagination of a place that never existed. Textual nostalgia, as I am formulating it, refers to this twin sense that A, thanks to the irreversibility of time, critics will almost certainly be prevented from recovering the desired past textual object in its plenitude, and B, that the project of recovery must necessarily be undertaken anyway, in fulfillment of the progressive march forward characteristic of modern scientific advancement. Such a process of recuperation within progress is, as 19th century New Testament textual critics openly acknowledged, likely to hurt. It is supposed to hurt, as all progress must. But this pain is a small price to pay for a deeply desired, scientifically reclaimed authentic text. Thus defined, textual nostalgia can readily be detected in Hoskier's attempt to restore the Textus Receptus to its rightful status. As he states, our scientific contention, briefly then, is this, that every passage must be weighed most carefully in whatever manuscript occurring apart from, as well as in connection with, the characteristics of that manuscript, or of other so-called sister manuscripts which agree with it in general or in that particular place. This kind of disciplined compiling and weighing will lead, Hoskier hypothesized, to the victory of the Church's traditional text. Rejecting the genealogical method practiced by Bergeon's rival Anglican colleagues Westcott and Hort, Hoskier argued that every manuscript must be subjected to the most searching criticism. No single manuscript, including a minuscule like Evangelium 604, can too quickly be interpreted as representative of an entire family and then either dismissed or elevated to a status of closest to or furthest away from the so-called original text. Science may require that certain traditional readings be abandoned, Hoskier admits, but he is willing to suffer such wounds for the sake of the Bible. The point here is not to defend Hoskier's perspective per se, but rather to notice the logistical structure of the rhetoric. The goal is to restore the genuine sacred text. The method must be scientific. The approach must be unbiased, and the results of the critical work must be accepted, even when the result is felt to be against the critic's own self-interest and theological convictions. Hoskier's enemies, Westcott and Hort, offered a similar rationale for their own methods. Criticism, they agreed, demands a disciplined attempt to strive against individual bias, including conformity to rationally framed or rather discovered rules, which impose salutary restraints on arbitrary or impulsive caprice. Unlike Hoskier, who in his Evangelium 604 advocated for the scrutiny of each manuscript individually, Westcott and Hort arranged manuscript witnesses within textual families they labeled Western, Alexandrian, and Syrian, situating them more firmly within the racist genealogical discourses that were the hallmark of Victorian science. Here's an image of these text types as reconfigured by Gunter Zunz in 1946. Laboring to identify the character of text types, they placed texts, not manuscripts, within hierarchical family trees that, in theory at least, could identify what was corrupt and what was, relatively speaking, neutral. As contemporaries of Darwin and heirs to the philological work of, for example, Johann Gottfried Herder, when New Testament scholars explored questions of origins, families, and descents, they certified their participation within a broader scientific discourse determined to trace languages, nations, human races, cultures, and species to the points of their origin. In textual criticism, this procedure also had the advantage of reducing the vast number of surviving manuscripts into manageable groupings that could be linked to specific locales, thereby offering a window not only into text, but into their contexts. Though Hoskier accused Westcott and Hort of applying their genealogical method unsystematically, he also adopted this same method in his subsequent work. Hoskier's later studies also failed to vindicate the traditional text, but his meticulous collations ended up contributing a great deal to the development of text-type family theories developed by others, including by Zunz. Textual criticism, as practiced in the 19th century, was therefore certified as scientific only insofar as editors expressed their willingness to suffer the consequences of what this science has wrought. Such a first step, second step approach to knowledge partook in a structure of belatedness characteristic of modern empiricism. Once the scientific work of rational men is complete, step 1, interpretation can commence, step 2. In the case of the New Testament, the hypothetical restoration of the author's own text had an extra benefit, albeit at the loss of some beloved passages. By recuperating the words of authors, textual criticism had the potential to connect readers to a divine author who inspired them. Like the Swiss mercenaries, the recipients of the improved text were forced to descend from the familiar fresh mountain air of primitive villages, that is, from the security of their traditional texts that included the passages that were then bracketed in so many critical editions, to dwell instead in the industrialized city where progress reigns. Bergeon and Hoskier were not quite ready to climb down. The modern city, however, beckoned with its compensatory access to authors and therefore indirectly to God himself. There's an example from Westcott and Hort's edition of the Gospels of the bracketing and setting aside of the story of the woman taken in adultery. Part 2, Scientism and the Secular New Testament Text. As the example of Hoskier and Bergeon versus Westcott and Hort has illustrated, throughout the 19th century, New Testament textual critics in Germany, Great Britain, and the United States labored to rescue New Testament authors from the corruptions of the past by the application of scientific methods to a long-lost but deeply desired object. To borrow Bruno Latour's terms, by conjuring inventions of scientific facts, conjoining inventions of scientific facts and citizens, emerging Protestant secularism opened the door for a wholly individual and wholly spiritual religion that enabled moderns like these men to be both secular and pious at the same time. In 1890, Hoskier was caught in the hairs of this project. As a fellow scientist, he had an obligation to pursue a reasoned method capable of restoring the original text. But the traditional text he was after, he candidly admitted, was important precisely because it was sacred and traditional. He therefore sought to combine the operative principles of scientific textual criticism that disavows dogmatic theological convictions when applying scientific methodologies, even as he undertook what was ultimately a theological project designed to recuperate a lost original sacred text that he was convinced coincided with the traditional text and not with Westcott and Hort's favorite exemplar, Codex Vaticanus. That's my dad. Hi, Dad, just go for it. This is your house. Operating within the discipline bound him to the rules of that discipline. And in the end, what he named as his quest, if not the data he collected, proved futile. Nevertheless, the rhetoric, if not the method, prevailed. A second, more contemporary example drawn from differing treatments of a variable passage in the Gospel of Mark further demonstrates the enduring character of these 19th century constraints on the current discipline. The verse, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, at Mark 1:1, appears in many manuscripts as the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, with Son of God omitted. As Tommy Wasserman has documented, the puzzle of this textual divergence has been much debated. Some, preferring the shorter reading, argue that the phrase was added, likely to bring Mark into closer conformity with later Christology. Others, preferring the longer reading, point out that the opening words are unlikely to be omitted, that they may have dropped out accidentally, and that Markan style favors inclusion. Persuaded by this analysis, as well as their own internal investigation of the matter, the editors responsible for the most up-to-date and comprehensive edition, the Novum Testamentum Graecum Editio Critica Maior, or the ECM of Mark, have printed the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, as Mark's initial text. That's the last example on this slide. You can see all the different options that have appeared since 1831 in a list on this slide. Remarkably, this decision departs from the text as printed only a decade earlier in the 28th revised edition of the Nestle Aland Novum Testamentum Graece, or affectionately known as the NI 28, also prepared for the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Germany. In contrast to the ECM, the NA 28 employs brackets as a device designed to indicate that Son of God may not have been present in the initial text. Since Eberhard Nestle's first edition of the Novum Testamentum Graece in 1898, the Nestle Aland editions have altered the appearance of Mark 1:1 twice, or 3 times if one includes the ECM. Though unstated, regular and frequent improvements like this signal that, like their predecessors, scientific editors are prepared to change their minds. They are prepared to suffer injury for the sake of their discipline. For a text to be regarded as scientific, it must be repeatedly altered. Yet these are social texts, not scientific ones, as this page of the Editio Critica Maior further documents. I hope you can see it. It's quite a detailed page, and you can barely tell what's going on, but I hope I'm going to explain it to you. The ECM's own ostensibly improved methods and technologies are visible in both the text and the apparatus on this page. The editors print the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, in Greek, obviously, as the primary text line. The reading, A, the presumed initial text. And then they label each Greek word with an even Arabic numeral. So the Greek word arche is the number 2, the Greek word 2, number 4, evangelium, number 6, and so on to the end of the verse, so that any addition of words may also be identified explicitly with odd numbers. The editors then record variant readings present in textual witnesses below the primary text. Each variant is listed on a scale from A to B and so on until they are all enumerated. Below a dividing line, witnesses are listed by numbers or abbreviations linking the variant readings to the documentary evidence. This critical apparatus, therefore, indicates an archive of textual witnesses and their readings with a democratic disinterestedness that, in theory at least, invites readers to consult the evidence, that is, the manuscripts, versions, and citations, from which both the printed text and its alternatives have been drawn. Other paratextual features on this page situate the project further. The chapter numbers, that is, chapter 1, verse 1 here, were introduced to New Testament texts in Paris to facilitate 13th century scholarship on the Latin Bible. The versification system, so verse 1 here, follows the Textus Receptus and decisions made by early modern printers, despite the rejection of that text by modern critics. Even the page number on the upper left corner, which somehow got cut off in this picture, has a history. The custom of identifying textual witnesses by sigla, you can see the long list of sigla and numbers in the apparatus, also has a history. Placing this page in place, space, and time. The reduction of manuscripts to manuscript text to a series of marks recognizable among those trained to read them goes back to the textual investigation of the humanists, though the ECM's particular system updates a structure invented by Caspar René Gregory in 1908 and a set of numbers first applied by Curtin Holland in 1963 in his comprehensive list of surviving New Testament manuscripts. Thus, the ECM does not so much print an Ausgangstext or initial text with supporting evidence, but an image that anchors the entire endeavor firmly within a tradition of modern European critical editing. A second example, also from Mark, can deepen this observation. At Mark 949, the ECM records the presence of the phrase, "everyone will be tested" instead of "everyone will be salted" in half a dozen manuscripts, albeit in two slightly different forms. What is not obvious, however, is that all but one of these manuscripts is a copy not of the Gospels, but of the 11th century Bishop Theophylact of Ochrid's commentary on the Gospels, with scriptural passages, or lemata, interwoven throughout. Theophylact's commentary placed Mark within a medieval tradition that assumed the evangelists and apostles were in harmonious agreement at all times and about every matter. He was therefore expanding Mark to show that the memories of this evangelist was in accord with the others. By contrast, the ECM abstracts Mark 949 and the tested by fire variant from its initial context, printing the testimony of witnesses, not manuscripts, and selecting a different reading for "everyone will be seasoned with fire" as the initial text. Theophylact's Mark mingled interpretation with text. The ECM avoids explicit interpretation and prints bare textual data instead. Even so, recovery of the work as a goal worth pursuing endures. Both Theophylact and the INTF treat New Testament texts as a ground upon which people, events, materials, and resources should be organized. The evangelists and the apostles are absent, their words and their actions distant, and the works they produced pluriform. Like texts, the methods required to rescue them alter in accord with the practical, theological, and political dispositions of every age. New Testament textual criticism and the Cold War, Part 3. As we have seen, textual criticism produces texts that are endlessly refreshed and therefore repeatedly changed in response to some new discovery, method, technology, or prevailing argument. New Testament textual criticism has therefore been more effective, or as effective, at organizing careers within European American academic prestige markets than at securing an unimpeachable key to what the New Testament truly is or should be. Our final case study toward a defense of this thesis is drawn from a Cold War era adventure in textual criticism as political, social, and intellectual intervention, the Library of Congress's microfilming projects in Jerusalem, Sinai, and Mount Athos. On March 22, 1949, Henry J. Cadbury, Hollis Professor of Divinity at Harvard, wrote to Kenneth Willis Clark, Professor of New Testament at Duke University, with a proposal. Would you be interested in serving as the annual professor of the American School in Jerusalem, and while there, leading a project to microfilm manuscripts held in the monastic libraries in Sinai and Jerusalem? In October of that same year, the American Committee of the International Greek New Testament Project secured a $12,000 grant, or $148,000 in today's dollars, for work toward the publication of a new critical apparatus for the Gospel of Luke. Clark accepted the invitation, and less than 3 weeks later, Carl Kraling, president of the American Schools of Oriental Research, head of Eastern Languages and Literatures at Yale, and frequent advisor to the United States State Department, formally invited him to take the position. Published only after his death, however, the envisioned apparatus suffered from numerous setbacks, including INTF founder Kurt Alon's scathing and unfair public critique of an early and privately disseminated specimen in 1965. By contrast, microfilming monastic manuscripts turned out to be a huge and immediate success. Celebrated in the popular press as well as by scholars in 1952, the IGNTP and the Library of Congress expanded the endeavor and traveled to the monasteries of Mount Athos to complete a similar project. Though this labor did not result in a fully satisfactory critical apparatus for Luke, it did produce numerous institutional and institutionalizing successes, coordinating not only careers and forms of evidence gathering, but also political, social, and economic objectives that in 1961, Dwight D. Eisenhower would call the military-industrial complex. Whatever Kenneth Clark and his colleagues intended when they set out for Jerusalem and Sinai in 1949, and whatever they explicitly knew, they were the direct beneficiaries of visible and invisible ties forged among state, military, industrial, and economic actors during the war's aftermath. In May 1948, the British Mandate Palestine formally ended, the State of Israel was founded, and the United States officially recognized the new nation. The Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, had been founded a year earlier, replacing the wartime Central Intelligence Group and Office of Strategic Services. That same year, Werner Clapp was appointed Chief Assistant Librarian of Congress, and Kenneth Clark celebrated his 10th year as a professor at Duke University. Meanwhile, the 26-year-old amateur archaeologist Wendell Phillips was in Egypt, digging up Stone Age men and dreaming up a microfilm project in Sinai. Microfilm had been put to good use during the war, both as a tool of espionage and as a method of preserving endangered documents and manuscripts. After the war, the Intelligence Advisory Board of the Central Intelligence Group employed microfilm to photograph, preserve, and process enemy documents. Thousands of canisters of microfilm were brought back to the United States from Germany for examination, a task that was entrusted to Werner Clapp. The Sinai microfilm expedition, Phillips hoped, would also play a role in intelligence gathering. The CIA would gain a convenient philanthropic front for their activities. The American Schools for Oriental Research would be given enviable access to the Library of St. Catherine's, and an additional stock of microfilms of precious manuscripts would be added to the growing collections of the Library of Congress. In 1949, Phillips was proposing yet another adventure to the CIA, this time to South Arabia, now Yemen. Vice Admiral A.D. Stubb informed Director Hillenkotter of the CIA that Phillips had obtained specially built trucks from the Chrysler Corporation and was seeking additional equipment, personnel, and presumably funding. Phillips also secured the necessary backing for the Sinai project, and that November, the Library of Congress entered a formal arrangement with Phillips' newly founded American Foundation for the Study of Man, contributing $25,000 or $433,929 today to the endeavor, and promising to pay all the necessary expenses, except for the transportation of the editor, that is Kenneth Clark, from Jerusalem to Sinai, and the subsistence for the photographer. Dr. Aziz Asatiya of Farouk University in Alexandria assisted Phillips in making the arrangements, obtaining formal permission from the Archbishop of Sinai for a fee of $10,000 or $124,709 today, and promising to contribute a full set of films to the National Library. In 1950, Clark, Atiyah, and a team of experts spent 8 months in Egypt photographing manuscripts and building the collection. Relations between the library and the monastery soured, however. The monastery expected to receive their own copies of the microfilm, but the library refused, claiming that the foundation made this promise independently of the library staff. Phillips was not only working to gather archaeological, anthropological, and manuscript data for the betterment of humankind. He was also looking for oil. In the 1940s, and early 1950s, the Sinai was both an important oil source and a highly strategic buffer zone between Egypt and Israel. The equipment designated for the Sinai microfilming expedition benefited from this situation. 4 motor vehicles equipped for desert travel, 2 gasoline generators and heavy cable, a typewriter and other office equipment, medical supplies, 3 microfilm cameras with book boxes, a 4x5 viewing camera, and more than 1,000 rolls of microfilm were sent to Egypt on the Ras Al Ardia, a massive oil tanker built in 1949 by Sun Shipbuilding and Drydock Company of Chester, Pennsylvania. Presumably, the ship was filled with oil upon its arrival in Egypt. By 1951, Phillips was attempting to get into the act. As the president of the newly formed Phil Pryor Corporation, he was granted an oil concession in Oman for the Dhofar City Service Petroleum Corporation of New York, and as he indicated to Dr. Aziz, he hoped to include Sinai in his plans. Phillips failed in Egypt, but within a few years, he had secured oil concessions in Oman, Bahrain, and eventually Yemen, despite offending everyone there. There he is in Yemen. For Phillips, and for many fortunate American statesmen and entrepreneurs, shouldering the responsibilities of the free world was as lucrative as it was time-consuming, and at his death in 1975, he was one of the richest men in the world. Meanwhile, his archaeological partners, William F. and Frank Albright, no relation, continued to conduct excavations throughout the Arabian Peninsula, defending Phillips to the press and their peers. In 1952, Kenneth Clark published the results of his trip to Sinai, listing the thousands of manuscripts he and his colleagues microfilmed in the checklists of manuscripts in St. Catherine's Monastery, Mount Sinai, which was purchasable by UNESCO coupons. In the foreword, Luther Evans, the Librarian of Congress, expressed his thanks to Dr. and Mrs. Clark for their, quote, unmitting perseverance in bringing the checklist to the public and the microfilm to the USA. In his introduction, Clark thanked the Archbishop of Sinai, Dr. Howard Clark Key, his wife, Adelaide Dickinson Clark, Professor Gerard Jurit of the University of Louvain, and others who assisted with various aspects of the project. The American Foundation for the Study of Man was also mentioned, but not Phillips, and Wallace Terry, the foundation's representative, was merely credited with managing transportation, machinery, and fuel, and other personal needs. Phillips noticed his conspicuous absence. In a letter from Dr. Aziz to Phillips in 1952, Aziz consoled his colleague, "I am not surprised about what you told me concerning Kenneth Clark's checklist. A long time ago, I saw clearly the type of person he was and told Bill, who insisted on taking his part until it was too late." Clark may have snubbed Phillips, but he accomplished a great deal for the International Greek New Testament Project, the Library of Congress, the American School, and his own career during the 14 months in Jerusalem and Sinai. He became nationally and internationally famous. While in Sinai, Clark responded to requests from Kurt Weitzman, the Princeton art historian, Marcel Richard, the director of the Institut for de Recherche et l'Histoire du Texte in Paris, and the Bollandists for images of manuscripts of particular interest. In Jerusalem and Sinai, he was offered manuscripts and other artifacts for sale for his own and the Duke collections, some of which he bought and are found in the Duke collections today. From Jerusalem, he assisted the president of Duke University in bringing the Dead Sea Scrolls to Durham, North Carolina for an exhibition. He also made lasting connections with the Palestine Archaeological Museum and the American Friends of the Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem, joining both institutions as a trustee. Presumably, he also enjoyed close acquaintance with the members of the staff of the American consulate in Jerusalem. The consulate shared the American School building, and when a new office was opened in Arab Jerusalem in August 1950, he was invited to the reception. Upon his return to Durham, Clark published numerous pamphlets and articles, including 2 checklists for the Library of Congress, and gave regular speeches about the project across the United States and even in Russia. All the while, he served as the chairman of the Greek Manuscripts Committee of the IGNTP, coordinating preparations for the planned but unrealized critical apparatus. For Clark, personally and professionally, the trip had been a resounding success. The truths of science. As Annabelle Wharton has argued, behind each scientific skirmish is a battle for the control of reality. A highly researched and meticulously demonstrated claim wins when it is incorporated into the accepted truth of science and is no longer subjected to interrogation. The IGNTP's critical apparatus of the Gospel of Luke failed in this regard, though its vision, if not its method, lives on both in the library's microfilms and in the meticulous accounting of thousands of manuscript, versional, and patristic witnesses digitized, processed, and compared at places like the Institute for New Testament Text Critical Research in Germany and the IGNTP itself, now headquartered in Birmingham, England. If success is measured in terms of the establishment of an unimpeachable Ausgangstext, the Nestle Aland and the ECM editions have also failed, though these editions continue to provide opportunities for younger as well as more senior scholars to pursue groundbreaking research into the histories and significance of thousands of manuscripts. Bergeon and Hoskier also fell short of their ambitions. The Textus Receptus endures as a relic of 17th century Protestant expertise, and while some churches continue to depend upon it, scholars associated with prestigious institutions of higher learning do not. What has less often been explicitly noted, however, is how successful text critical work has been at serving the requirements of colonialism, nationalism, industry, and even war. Textual criticism has been adept at, to paraphrase Ariel Aisha Azule, shredding through endless devices into collectible pieces that can be processed through future devices. She continues, the archive enables the regulation of this violence to a past for which it acts as a guardian. It is this bygone time that the archive seeks to achieve. That is its unstated mission, its project, its goal. In other words, by flattening humanly situated manuscripts to the status of bare textual data, extracting this data for reprocessing within a forward marching progress that never bothers to look up, and continually inventing yet another device that keeps the system going, the unimpeachable, impeachable text is very much alive, even if Mr. Casaubon is not. But wait. I confess that it is I who have been behaving like Mr. Casaubon in this story. I have amassed fields of data, much more than I have had time to enumerate this evening. I have spent hours poring over old books and finding nothing but fault with the insights and labors of others. My own disenchantment has made a curmudgeon out of me too. Yet, as Wharton has pointed out, scholarly success regularly requires misrecognition of the specific stakes of the discipline. It is the inability to recognize these stakes and to count their costs that makes knowledge possible at all. Castigating the figures that I have mentioned this evening is therefore a waste of time, though counting the costs of the various forms of knowledge they served can perhaps help us imagine a different way forward. That is what needs to come next, and I would welcome the chance to imagine that way forward with you. Folds, scuffs, tears, breaks, pencil marks, stamps, fingerprints, smudges, and mistakes on a manuscript or a discipline could be interpreted as indications of corruption, deterioration, and decay. Or they could invite further reflection on the resilience and survival of what has in fact been left behind for the sake of imagining who we might want to be now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, that was really, really kind of incredible. And as always, I always like to give a brief round of applause. I know it's a bit quiet in kind of the Zoom setting that we have here, but I promise you everybody's applauding back home.
Except for my dad needing to come in the kitchen at an inopportune moment, which was awesome and very Zoom-like, wasn't it?
It was. It really did. I can't pastor on Zoom. But okay, so we just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask just a few questions. And as always, should anyone have a question, please feel free to drop in the Q&A. So I'm at the graduate student level, and I'm kind of working on my own research. And when I kind of think of textual criticism, I often think, how do I kind of embrace this kind of methodology in my own research, but also from a more methodological perspective, how do you think textual criticism in the broad scope of late ancient history writing kind of evolves, right? So you make these kind of deductions, you work with different manuscripts, and how does it kind of impinge the process of history writing for scholars who maybe aren't specialists in exactly what you do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think an obvious easy answer is that often whatever kind of historian we are, whatever kind of text or literary text we might be investigating, whether it's Homer's Odyssey or Gregor of Nyssa's sermons or whatever, we're usually engaging those through critical editions. And if we're engaging them through critical editions, we're engaging them through critical editions that are made according to the assumptions of that discipline as it emerged primarily in the 19th century. There's a much longer history that goes all the way back to the humanists that we could trace that has to do with certain kinds of debates between Catholics and Protestants at the very beginning of the of humanism as that continues into the Enlightenment. But we obviously don't have time to go into all of that, the details of that history. But I think it's helpful to be aware that we're not receiving the text. What we are receiving in a critical edition is a text that's very much a historically situated social product. What we want to do with that information is, of course, up to us. Sometimes we just want to read a text. I mean, the last slide was from the manuscript of Middlemarch that's in the British Library. And I love the last line of Middlemarch, like I memorized it. And the manuscript is different from the version I know. Yeah. So do I just want to read Middlemarch, like the one that I have in my Penguin edition, or do I want to go read the manuscript and find out that George Eliot actually might have said something else? Maybe it depends what the project is. Yeah. But at the very least, we can be aware that we're not simply receiving some kind of text in and of itself that doesn't exist outside of its embodied life in a book or a manuscript.
Yeah. And on that, kind of also based on what you presented today, what do you kind of imagine as a different way forward for text criticism? Just kind of based on what you've said so far.
Yeah. I wish you would tell me. I'm really thinking about this. That's why I had that sort of inside joke to myself, or like, let's be honest, you've become Mr. Casaubon here, not the other way around, because I don't have a positive proposal right now. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about it. And I just have a lot of respect and admiration for many textual critics who have been very generous to me. I couldn't have traced out all of this historical detail if they hadn't been willing to answer my phone call and let me visit their institutes and worked with me for many, many years. So I don't know. I mean, a part of me wants to just say, let's stop and let's just all read, let's read a Greek minuscule manuscript like Egerton's 2610 and make that be our text of the New Testament now or something, because, at least then we're not pretending that we're not receiving this sort of disavowed history, which is what scientific or scientistically produced New Testament texts allow us to do. But I don't know that that doesn't undo anything. We can't undo the histories within which we live. But perhaps what we can do is recognize that we too are bodies in space and time, and that we have responsibilities not only to these disembodied texts, but to all of the people who might have touched them in the past. And we can't obviously live up to that responsibility at every moment of time, but we can at least think about those people and those other lives that have touched these documents.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a great parting thought. So this is just the time. And perhaps we can all work on imagining a different way forward. Again, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. And thank you for everyone for coming out. Yeah, and have a great evening.